Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 102 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Fia is here as well. And Gavin,
Heyo.
You're going to be getting married a second time.
I sure did, actually, at the time the people are hearing this.
Time travel.
Yeah, I had my belated wedding reception this past weekend. As you may or may not know, if you are new to the podcast, me and my wonderful wife Liz, featured on last episode. We actually got married back in May, but originally we were supposed to get married in November, and we planned on coming out to New York for Christmas when we were still living in California. So we planned to have like the New York reception for my family, so that not my entire extended family had to fly all the way out to California. Around the same time we were going to come out for Christmas. So everything in California got moved up when I found out I got the job here in Pennsylvania, but the New York one could not be moved. So we are just casually having a reception like 7 months after we actually got married.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Hooray.
It is. Mike and I are gonna get to see each other's faces, which is always nice.
You know who's not going to be there? Fia.
Wah, wah.
She has reasons, though. I've been in her shoes, in the grad school shoes, so I totally understand.
I really tried to think hard about how I could make it work, but
I know, buddy.
There just was not enough hours in the day.
No, I get you for sure.
Can we do an episode on why there's only 24 hours in a day?
Yeah.
I'll put that on the list because there's more to that than you think.
Good. Let's do that right after, why the hell can't I photosynthesize?
2023? No, 2022 was a leap year. Dang it, we missed our chance.
No, 2020 was, it's every election year. It's 2020 and then 2024.
Was it? Oh. Okay, so we'll save that should the podcast be running in a year and 2 months from now. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, presuming the world is still here. Anyway, this is a fun episode. We're talking about grass. Once again, delving into the plants, which make me violently uncomfortable. But
plants that make you violently uncomfortable. What kind of plants are we talking about here, Gavin?
All plants. I don't like them. They do things very differently than the proper life forms, animals. But they're important to learn about, especially grass, particularly for the groups of animals that I deal with when I do research things. So we're going to be talking about grass, but before that, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Fia?
Just a reminder to don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the podcast. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, be sure to fill out our guest form, and all of this can be found in the show notes. Now, Gavin, question for you. What are we going to be talking about next episode?
Next episode, we're going to be talking about a particular person in paleontology history. We've only done that one other time in episode 67, so almost a year ago, where we talked about Nicholas Steno, who was a big guy in geology. But next week, or next episode, we're going to be talking about Georges Cuvier. And yes, I'm going to be that obnoxious and French about it every time. He is more or less considered one of the big founders of at least vertebrate paleontology. So we're going to be talking about him, his life and times, and how he helped vertebrate paleontology get to where it is today.
Very cool.
And so, with the house now kept, what happened today, Mike? Give us a today in history.
So, I got three questions for you guys. Number one, are you familiar with the president?
Yes.
Which one?
Just like the concept of the president.
Okay. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the king
of England?
Their position?
Just like the theoretical idea of a king.
Elvis?
Okay.
Are you familiar with the time that the president met the king?
No.
Oh, Gavin, you were right there. So on December 21st, 1970, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, walked into the White House.
I said that
And-
as a complete joke.
No, you were 100% right. Walked into the White House, high as a kite and with a Colt 45 to try and get a drug enforcement badge from, I believe, the Bureau of Narcotics, because he believed if he had that, he'd be able to carry drugs everywhere in the world.
Oh my God.
And he went, and looking absolutely stoned, he got one of my favorite pictures of all time taken with President of the United States, Richard Nixon. And so the photograph of when the president met the king is just legendary. I believe it was one of the most downloaded photos once it became available, or most requested photos once it became available from the National Archives. And if you get a second, just look up Elvis Nixon, and you won't be disappointed.
I'll do that.
Because have you seen this photograph?
No.
No.
Oh my God, look it up. It is absolutely incredible. Yup. You got Elvis in here, unbuttoned shirt, chained, giant belt buckle. Nixon, looking like Nixon, in the Oval Office.
That's crazy.
While he's just waltzed in there to get more drugs.
Also, Nixon was not the president I thought you were going to say, because this was quite a bit after Elvis was like super popular.
Yeah, I believe this is closer to the end of his life. I suppose it would have made more sense if he was there when like Kennedy was in office, considering Kennedy's lifestyle.
Yeah, that too.
But it is this. There's been a couple of movies made about this, just like this interaction. I don't know if they're any good, but I know they exist.
Well, the more you know.
Yeah.
Today
I
in
need
history,
I need to stop being accidentally right on the podcast
Yeah.
about things.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, that. Tell you what,
Because it started way back in like episode 2 or 3,
I think. Yeah,
where I
My
predicted the Capitol insurrection.
Maybe you could use your powers for good, Gavin, and you can.
I don't even know
accidentally
how to use
predict
my powers yet. Is this the start of my anime arc?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for that wonderful history, Mike. Fia, what's going on in the swamp?
Yeah. What is going on in the swamp? I do wonder that. I'll first hit you with a nice dad joke. Festive, if you will. How did Santa get rid of the grass in his gardens?
Get rid of the grass in what?
In his garden?
In his garden?
I don't know.
He slays it or
Ho,
something?
ho, ho.
Oh,
Ho, ho, ho.
the
I have a
garden
story.
tool.
Alright.
I get you. All right. Go ahead, Mike.
So real quick, are you guys familiar with the Cat in the Hat movie?
Yeah.
Vaguely. I feel like I've seen part of it once.
So, and there's a point in that movie where like the Cat in the Hat has a garden hoe and he throws it down and he's like, you dirty hoe. I saw that as a child and just thought that was a funny moment and did not know the larger context. So then later on that week, when I said to my sister, "Oh, you dirty hoe," I got in a lot of trouble from my parents, and I didn't know why for a long time.
They never
Wow.
explained that it was a bad word.
They eventually
Or like
realized
what it was.
had happened.
Yeah.
They eventually realized what had happened and eased up on me. But yeah, so that's my story, Fia. Where were you going with this?
That was it for the dad joke, but for Swamp Corner, I have a grass to tell you about. This species is called Spartina alterniflora, but was recently renamed Sporobolus alterniflorus, which a lot of people are kind of mad about, but whatever.
Lumping and splitting. Some people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's always a thing in how we give things names, where it's like, how different is different enough to put something in a different genus,
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
So apparently, and it also bothers me because occasionally, sometimes they will not change the species name as well, which it looks like they did here, but it goes from alterniflora to alterniflorus, which is good. That is proper. I believe that is Greek.
Nice. Well, anyway, this can also be called smooth cordgrass, salt marsh cordgrass, or saltwater cordgrass, or just cordgrass. They're found in estuarine salt marshes along the Atlantic coast, starting in America from, well, I guess the Americas, from Canada and then all the way down to North Argentina. They can grow up to 4 feet and 11 inches tall. Not really that tall, but if you're short like me, that's kind of tall. The reason why I picked this grass is because it's the dominant species of marsh grass in Louisiana and probably in other places too, but it's really notable in what I work with in the estuaries because they act as an ecosystem engineer, which are organisms that can either directly or indirectly affect the ability of resources to other species and also changing like the physical state of materials in the ecosystem. And so how that works is that these marsh grasses will grow right on the edge of like a channel of marsh water, and they'll accumulate sediment in between the roots and everything, and then they can also, that allows for things like mussels to attach and be able to use that area as a habitat. And then eventually this process, they're growing like into the water and then accumulating sediment and growing into the water, accumulating sediment over and over. And it's basically building land over and over. And so this species is really important in Louisiana because we're seeing a lot of land loss on the edges of our coast. Yeah. And so a lot of people are putting in money into restoration efforts for the Spartina species to kind of rebuild those areas where they've lost a ton of it. And they are potentially going to act as something that will continue to keep growing and building the land back of what we are losing and will be losing in the future.
Cool. Yeah, it's always cool to see different ways, because everybody hears about like sustainability type things in regards to like renewable energy. Especially with the news, at least for us this past couple days with like the new nuclear fusion reaction that they were able to do. But using ecosystem stuff is also a really good, method to do sustainable things. So
right. The big thing in Louisiana is living shorelines is what they call it, using living organisms to build a shoreline. So that's also includes oysters too.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you
with
for
that,
that.
go ahead, Gavin. Tell us some more about some grass.
Yeah. So grass. It feels weird to be describing what grass is because everybody kind of knows what grass is, or do they?
Do I know what grass is?
Is grass the same around the world? Like if I go to Australia, do they have special grass, or is that going to be the same as where I live?
It depends on what you mean by grass.
Here we go. All right, definitions. All right.
Ooh. So, I have.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm excited.
Oh, okay.
I'm just excited.
Me too. So grasses are a family of flowering plants, and we'll get into what that means in a bit. And the family is called Poaceae. This is part of why I don't like plants, is because animal families end properly. They all end in the letters I, D, E, A. And so, for example, the horse family is Equidae. And to me, that just sounds better. Plant families end in AC. And I don't know why. I don't know the root to that. This is just me being biased. These are purely my biases in here. So, yes, grasses are any member of the family Poaceae. And it is a really large family of plants. The only ones bigger than it are the coffee family, the legumes and beans, the daisies and sunflowers, and the orchids, which the daisies and sunflowers and the orchids are like by far the biggest. Those two are like far and away the most, they have the most species in them. But the grass family is chilling in 5th place, so still pretty big. And even though those other families are bigger, grasses are probably the most familiar group of plants to most people, even if you kind of don't realize it. Because grasses include basically every kind of plant that you eat that isn't like directly a fruit. For example, wheat, barley, rye, oats, rice, corn, and sorghum and millet, which are very commonly used in like cereal grains. All of those are grasses.
I would love to just have a front yard that is made of corn grass.
So there isn't necessarily like corn grass, but like the corn fields
Yeah.
are
Or
grasses. Yeah.
But like you could say that it is grass, technically, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I bet your HOA would not be happy with that. They're
Probably
very
not.
strict about grass.
Oh, are they?
Yeah. It's like, this is why, like, no matter, we've been looking at like buying houses lately, and my one stipulation, not that they're common around where I live here in Pennsylvania, but having a homeowners association is an absolute deal breaker for me.
I mean,
like, I don't.
why would you want that headache?
Exactly. I don't want my neighbors coming around with a ruler and like measuring how tall my lawn is, and then like fining me if it's like a quarter of an inch too tall. No, thank you. Anyway, so all of those various food things are grasses, but also some others include bamboo is a grass, sugarcane, and reeds. Not necessarily things like cattails; those aren't grasses, but reeds that have like the tall, fluffy kind of top to them. Those are grasses. And also, of course, all the various grasses that make up things like your lawns and your golf courses and things for other sports as well. So, just by all of those things, grass is much more diverse than you were probably thinking. Because, like me, when I started doing this research for this episode, you probably just thought, "Oh, it's the stuff in my lawn," or it's the stuff out on the Great Plains that is like kind of goldish in color that blows nicely in the wind. But it is so much more than that. So let's talk about some of the plant anatomy of grass. And this is where I'm going to be uncomfortable because I don't know plant anatomy very well. So
it's okay. We accept you.
Right. I just have to be confident and nobody will know any better. So, like I said, grasses are flowering plants, which means that they produce flowers, which then produce fruit with their seeds inside. Flowering plants are the vast majority of plants around today. Basically, everything that's not a conifer, a fern, or a moss is a flowering plant. And the scientific name for this group of plants are called the angiosperms. And there are two large groups within that. So there's the dicots and the monocots. Dicots are most flowering plants, and basically the main difference between these two groups is that dicots, when their seed sprouts, it has two little leaves. The sort of iconic, you have like a seed, and then the little tiny sprout that comes out has two little baby leaves on it. That's why they're called dicot. Monocots only have one. That's sort of the biggest difference. And so grasses are monocots. They only have the one leaf. But like I said, most flowering plants are dicots with the two leaves. And this might seem kind of arbitrary, but there's also a lot of very arbitrary separations within animals as well. So, for example, one of the biggest splits in animals is when you're developing as an embryo, which hole develops first, your mouth or your anus?
Oh, yes.
So with most animals, it's actually the mouth, which would be most of your invertebrates.
Are we anus one?
We sure are. Vertebrates
Then that's
and
just
also
not right if it's hole number one, even though it should be hole number two. Like
yeah, for us anyway. Us vertebrates and echinoderms, so starfish, like crinoids, sea urchins, things like that. We all develop anus first and then mouth. So, fun fact. if you thought the one leaf, two leaf thing was just like, well, that's kind of random.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, the various relations within grasses. So here are just some general features of like when you see a grass, these are how you know it is a grass. So grasses are herbaceous, meaning that they don't have wood. So they don't make trees, which is a little deceiving with some of them because bamboo sure seems very wood-like, but it's not technically wood.
What?
Oh, go ahead.
What do you mean? Like, it seems wood-like?
Just because of how hard it is and that it's often used for building material. For example, in a lot of places in Southeast Asia, when they're building buildings, they make the scaffolding around the building out of bamboo.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. The stem of grasses. So if you picture like bamboo in your brain, that's actually a pretty good representation just because it is so big and it makes all of these features pretty obvious. The stem of grasses is hollow and generally cylindrical. However, there are plugs in the hollow tubes, which is where the leaves grow. So if you think of like a stalk of bamboo, how it's got like the sections.
Oh, yeah.
Each of the sections, there is sort of like a stopper in the tube, and that is the spot where leaves grow out of.
And that's for all grasses?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, with like lawn grasses, it's harder to tell. But
right.
Bamboo is a good sort of model just because it is big and noticeable.
Yes.
The actual leaf blades of many grasses are filled with these tiny shards of glass called phytoliths. And these are there basically to deter predators, which in this case are herbivores, and also for a little bit of like structural support. Yeah, so they just kind of naturally grow glass within them to make themselves harder to chew. And there are even grasses that you've probably heard of called sawgrass and swordgrass that are extra sharp.
I'm getting PTSD.
Yep.
I'm sure sawgrass down there for you anytime you're in the field is a big thing.
Yes. It's very common.
Yeah.
No bueno.
And flowers are generally the most complicated part of flowering plant anatomy, so we're not going to go too much into the flower of grasses. But most grasses are hermaphroditic, meaning that they have both male and female parts, so they can self-fertilize if necessary. Although most grasses are wind pollinated, so they don't typically have insect pollinators like a lot of fruits do. Although, funnily enough, corn is a very notable exception. There are male and female corn plants.
Well,
is there any difference with the actual corn that's produced?
I don't believe so. Like I'm only the female would make the seeds because the fruit generally. So, for example, when you're eating an apple, that is more or less the ovary of an apple tree.
And when you put it that way.
Yeah, it's a little weird. But in the case of corn, for example, that would be the corn kernels, where it's like the main sort of yellow part that you think of is the quote-unquote fruit of these plants. Whereas the little sort of white part at the bottom that is like connects the yellow part to the corn cob, that's the seed. And in general, because grasses tend to be smaller plants, the seeds are also quite small and generally fairly similar to things like corn kernels. So that's some of the general features, like anatomy of grasses. But grasses also do something real weird compared to many other plants. Not all other plants, but they do photosynthesis in a weird way. And here we're going to go back to sort of ninth grade biology.
Hooray.
So, Photosynthesis is really complicated, so we're not going to really go into all of it, but...
Well, that's a shame because I asked for questions.
Okay, go ahead. What do you got?
Why can't we photosynthesize?
I should have seen that coming.
I warned you.
Because we're not plants.
Okay, well, why not?
We don't have chloroplasts, which is the organelle inside plant cells that does photosynthesis.
Why didn't Darwin get on that one?
I don't know, Ben. He should have.
It's also because we grew an anus first, so...
That too, yeah.
Fia said anus.
There are some invertebrates that like sort of kind of do photosynthesis.
Wait, what?
Not themselves directly. They do it a variety of ways. So, for example, coral. They do They themselves don't, but they have microscopic, like a symbiotic organism that lives inside of them that does photosynthesis. That's also true of some bivalves as well.
Look, I'm a little weary on genetic engineering on humans, but if we can get some coral and mix it with a whatever, and you shoot the lasers and the radioactive spider comes in, and then we can photosynthesize, sure. I'm in. I'm all for it. Make it happen. Moving on. What was your point?
Yeah, so grass do photosynthesis. What was that for you?
I said we could end world hunger that way.
Yeah.
Oh, we sure could. Yeah. Who needs to eat? I'm just making food myself. Like, I'm not out here getting a tan. I'm eating. Thank you.
Yes. Anyway, back to the basics.
Yes, grasses. So, Mike, what is the main goal of photosynthesis?
To turn sunlight into nutrition, sugars, I believe specifically, in order to power the life of the plant, was always my rough understanding.
More or less. So, it uses sunlight to actually, it doesn't turn sunlight into something else. That is like sort of the gas that they put into, no, it's not even a good example. I was trying to come up with an analogy off the fly and I could not, but,
off the fly.
You know what I meant. So the goal of photosynthesis is to take carbon dioxide, and then they use the energy from the sun to turn carbon dioxide and certain other molecules into sugars, most of the time glucose. And as a byproduct, literally just as the waste, so the same process that you do respiration, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, where carbon dioxide is the waste product for our respiration, water and oxygen are the waste product for photosynthesis. And so there are a couple of different ways that plants do this, 3 main ones. So I'm not, again, going to go into the deep molecular details here, but we're going to talk about the main 3. So the first one is the weirdest. We're just going to touch on it really quickly. It's called CAM photosynthesis, or crassulacean acid metabolism, if you're fancy. This is a weird type used by plants that live in like hyper arid environments. So like 99% of cacti use this, and most succulents do this too. Basically, they collect CO2 and they sort of convert it to a different molecule at nighttime, and then do the actual photosynthesis during the day. And they do this in order to save water, because in order to absorb carbon dioxide, they need to open these little pores on their leaves. And when those pores are open, water can also leave. So they don't want to do that during the day when the most water is going to leave. So they sort of do part during the day and then part during the night. Yeah, so that's pretty much the only way that they are able to live in such like super arid environments that they do. But that is the vast minority of plants. That is like maybe 2% of all plants do photosynthesis like that. The most common type of photosynthesis is called C3. And this is about 95% of all plant biomass. So I don't know exactly how many species, but almost all of the plants you can think of do photosynthesis the regular way. And even some grasses. So, for example, rice, wheat, and barley do this. So some of the most important, agricultural plants do photosynthesis like this. And so basically, it is the most direct way to process carbon dioxide into sugar, but it can be inefficient if it gets too dry. So the plants will close their pores that let the CO2 in if it gets too dry in order to not dry themselves out. But in order to do this, they basically make it so that oxygen can no longer get out, because that is how their waste product oxygen leaves as well. And so sort of an enzyme that they use in photosynthesis will also bond with oxygen, just like it will with CO2. And if it bonds with oxygen, the byproduct of that doesn't produce any energy for them. So they're basically wasting energy to make this thing that is useless. And so it is really efficient if you have lots of water around, but if you start drying out, this becomes really bad for plants. But most plants live in places like rainforests or even just regular forests, where it typically doesn't get all that dry on a day-to-day basis. But the ones that are not quite deserty, but also not a forest, do the last type of photosynthesis, which is called C4. And this is done by lots of grasses, particularly grasses in places like savannas and prairies. So like the big grasslands in places like Africa, or here in North America as well. And this sort of adds a step before the actual photosynthesis happens, where CO2 is bonded to an extra molecule for storage to use later. And this sort of adds an extra step. So it technically is a little less efficient than the other more common photosynthesis. But because they sort of do this roundabout, they can still do photosynthesis when they close up their pores and still have it be efficient when they close up their pores to prevent from drying out.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's neat that sort of evolution came up with different ways to solve the same problem pretty much. And so this is only around 3% of plants. And of that 3%, about half are grasses.
Wow.
So most of the plants that do this are grasses. And this is very important to the history of grasses through time, but we'll circle back to that in a little bit.
Nice.
So this next section is called humans and grasses, because humans and grasses are very intertwined, as you might have guessed by all of the plants that I listed at the beginning being most of our major economic food crops. So most of the world relies on grasses as the main part of their diet. 70%, so 70% of grown crops, so all of the crops in the world are grasses.
Wow.
Yeah. And rice, wheat, and corn, just those three, provide over 50% of all the calories eaten by humans globally.
Jeez.
Yeah. And when we talk about just rice alone, rice is considered the world's most important food because over half of the human population relies on rice as its main grain. Because think about where rice is a very common staple food in places like Asia and places like India, where just between China and India, those two countries are somewhere in the ballpark of a third,
Yeah.
a quarter to a third of all humans. So
that's crazy.
Yeah. So those three grasses, rice, wheat, and corn, incredibly economically important. And even just sort of think about the things that you eat throughout a day. If you have cereal or oatmeal for breakfast, those are grasses. You had some toast with your eggs, grass. You had a sandwich for lunch, that bread, grass. You had chicken parm for dinner. The breading on the chicken made of grass. The pasta made out of grass. You eat more meat than the average person. Looking at you, America. Basically, all meat products are fed grasses throughout their life, things like wheat and hay and corn, and that also applies to dairy because they have to produce the milk somehow. And then in basically everything else, cane sugar or corn syrup are added to basically everything.
This makes me angry because I
Why?
hate grass. I hate grass so much. Stereotypically, I hate grass, not in the sense of knowing that it's, a food source and that, like, wheat I wouldn't have guessed as a grass or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
lawn grass is just pointless, in my opinion, and
It sure is, and
it
we'll talk
makes
about
me
that.
angry. And so
Yep.
now I'm just like, my whole life revolves around grass, and I'm not comfortable with that.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And then even in ways that you probably wouldn't think of off the top of your head, grass impacts many parts of life. For example, a lot of oils, like vegetable oil, can be made out of things like rice or corn. Almost all common alcohols are made from grasses, with the main notable exception is that some vodkas, not all of them, some use potatoes, but actually most, and even the traditional production of vodka is using grasses, because potatoes didn't make their way to Europe until like the late 1500s.
I thought you were going to tell me that potatoes were actually a type of grass.
Yeah, I was
No.
about to get my mind blown.
No, potatoes are not grasses.
Thank God.
Yes, something in your life is whole, Fia.
Yes, thank you.
And then lastly, just as sort of a way that you might not think of, ethanol makes up around 10% of most gasoline here in the United States, and ethanol comes from corn. And so gas would be, give or take, 15 to 20% more expensive without that added ethanol. So when you fill up your car, you're setting a big cornfield on fire.
Oh God.
And that's just the food part, food and also the gas there. We use grass for everything. Like I said, in Western countries, we have grass lawns. Typically, it is non-native grass, but it is still grass. If you are not bound by an HOA, try to grow native grasses in your lawn, please. It's better for everybody.
Yeah.
Most of all of our sports use grass fields. I mean, some these days use like AstroTurf, but even things like tennis use grass courts every now and then.
Really?
Golf, Mike, you would know more than I would, but are most baseball fields AstroTurf, or are there some that use actual natural grass?
The majority of them are going to be some sort of grass.
Okay. Yeah, so and football, I think, is probably mostly AstroTurf, but I'm sure there are some that might use grass. In many places elsewhere in the world, in places like Asia, like I mentioned earlier, bamboo is a popular building material. In many places around Africa, reeds are used to make roofs. So everything from the food you eat to the structure that you are in to the leisure activities that you do, it's all grass, baby. Here in Pennsylvania, we have a big acid water problem from all of the abandoned mines. As they dissolve various things in the mine, it turns the water, just like the natural flowing water, acidic. But wetlands that have grasses along with lots of other plants are used to treat that water to make it better for the environment. That's something that my department here at the university that I work at does a lot of. Like that one faculty member who just retired, that's like mainly what he did all of his research on.
Wow.
And there's also been a shift in the last handful of years pushing for paper products to be made out of grasses instead of wood, because grasses grow back much faster than trees do.
That's an interesting concept. I had not heard
famously,
before.
bamboo is the fastest growing plant in the world, and it's a grass.
Did not know that.
Yeah. Bamboo, you can literally, if you were to just like camp out in front of a bamboo stalk, you can watch it grow. Like it will grow like a couple centimeters to, depending on what type of bamboo it is, like a couple inches per hour.
What?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, like you can plant it, or at least, it will sprout at breakfast, and then by the time you go to bed, it could be like up to your knee or higher.
Whoa. Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. And also, because of those sort of plug parts that I mentioned earlier, like if you picture a bamboo, how there's each of the sections, if you cut it, it'll start growing back from that section. Unlike a tree, where if you cut it down, that tree is not going to grow back. So you can harvest the same bamboo plant over and over and over, which is obviously much more sustainable. And also, you can still make paper out of it. So I personally, in my mind, I don't understand why we don't do this yet. Anywho, we're just, and that is, again, all of this is just barely scratching the surface of what grasses can be used for by humans. And that's not even including the really deep evolutionary relationship we've had with grass. There's a lot of speculation that grasslands are what sort of allowed humans to leave the trees, our ancestors, and become bipedal. That grasslands played a big part in our ability to do that. That's very speculative, but I thought I'd throw that out there.
Nice.
So let's talk a bit about plant evolution and grass evolution in general, because plant fossil record is very strange, because plants tend to be soft, particularly grasses, because they are not woody, so they don't make good fossils generally. But here's some of the things that we do know. So in the show notes, I'll post a link to a open access paper. It's really good and summarizes a good amount of grass evolution. It's a little bit out of date, so some of the things in it have since been corrected. But I really liked it because at one point I was reading this paper and I looked at it, and one of the figures, I had two sort of like trees of life showing different groups of grass, two of them side by side. And as I looked at them, I'm like, those are the same tree. Like they have the same relationships between all the grasses, but the names are just sort of in a slightly different order, but the result is the same. And so I was like, oh, come on. Like, how did you miss that? And then I actually read the figure caption, and it explains why they are the same. So I was like, oh, good job, paper. You're actually being, you're actually doing a good job teaching, which is nice.
Good.
So in general, flowering plants, the larger group of plants that grasses are in, evolved from conifers, things like pines and spruces, sometime in the early Cretaceous period, around 130 million years ago. So in the grand scheme of things, fairly recent. And from what I could find, grasses likely came around pretty soon after that, somewhere around 125 or so million years ago. But we don't really have any plant fossils from that time, especially not like a body fossil of a plant. So you crack open a rock and there's just a grass fossil inside. We don't really have anything like that from this time. But those little tiny shards of glass that grasses have inside of them, and these aren't the only plants that have this. A couple of other kinds of plants have this as well, but they all form in very particular spiky shapes, and you can tell based on the different spikes in different places. This phytolith shard of glass came from a grass. This shape came from a different type of plant. So we see very grass-like phytoliths around 105 million years ago, as well as grass-like pollen. Pollen is a really good way to look for something in the fossil record, because pollen is basically indestructible.
Really?
Yeah, pollen is I don't know. Just the various proteins and materials that it's made out of are just incredibly sturdy. So obviously you can't get like DNA from it or anything, but the structure of like the outside of the pollen itself is incredibly hardy. And so we see pollen that looks very similar to modern grass pollen all the way back around 105 or so million years ago. And it's kind of thought that they were around and abundant enough to spread all around the world when the continents were still fairly close together, but still quite a bit after Pangea had broken up. Because the nice thing about pollen, and depending on how big your seeds, is that they can be picked up and moved around. So grass is found on every continent, technically including Antarctica, because there is like 1 or 2 islands that have grass. I don't believe we found any grass pollen from Antarctica, but that might be wrong. So grasses were fairly widespread by the end of the Cretaceous period when the dinosaurs went extinct, but we're not like major parts of their ecosystems yet. Where you see most of the discussion about grass evolution is fairly recent, all things considered, in the late Eocene, early Oligocene, so somewhere in the ballpark of 34 million years ago. So a big step, forward from that 105.
Mm-hmm.
Around this time, the world was cooling and drying for a variety of reasons. Number one, Antarctica, episode 91, was moving south and growing those glaciers, and glaciers reflect sunlight back out into space, which cools down the planet. As the planet cools, more ice can grow, which reflects more sunlight, and you get sort of a positive feedback that way. Antarctica was also recently freed from Australia, and this allowed an ocean current to form that just flows in a big circle around Antarctica, which helps sort of isolate it and cool it down even more. So, and even more, positive feedback loop.
So do you know how cold it got around this time?
Still warmer than today.
Okay.
But cold enough that we were seeing large-scale permanent glaciers for the first time in a very long time in Earth's history. I think the last time that there were large-scale permanent glaciers before this was at the beginning of the Permian, around 300 or so million years ago. So it had been over 200 million years since there had been glaciers. But temperature-wise, it would be still a bit warmer than today, generally.
Gotcha.
On the complete opposite side of the world, the Himalaya Mountains, which are formed by India slamming into Eurasia, had been being built for a few million years by this point, which, number one, messes with global air currents because they are just so stinking tall. So that does some weird climate things. And also, when certain kinds of rock weather and break down, that absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which, less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere lowers global temperatures. Also, on, again, the complete opposite side of the world, the Andes Mountains were also being built around this time, maybe a little more recently than this 34 million years. But in this same general ballpark, the Andes Mountains were starting to be built. The Rocky Mountains were definitely already built by this time, but were roughly the size that the Himalayas are today. And also were just soaking up lots of CO2. So there were lots and lots of new large mountain ranges that were soaking up all of this carbon dioxide. So
nice.
All of these things combined lower global temperatures, which in turn also decreases general global humidity as well. And so all of these things combined, starting around 49 million years or so is when it started, this general trend, but it really kicked off, like I said, around 34 million years ago, and then kicking into turbo maximum overdrive in the Oligocene into the Miocene epoch, so in the span of, like I said, roughly 34 to about 12 million years ago. And during this time, obviously global climate's changing, things that are less well adapted to cooler and drier climates aren't going to do as well. And so in continental interiors, especially where there is just generally less water, things that needed a lot of water, especially trees, were just not doing as well. And so if all the trees were sort of receding, something has to come in and fill their place. And coincidentally, around the start of the Oligocene, so again, give or take 30 million years or so ago, that's roughly when the first plants, including grasses, evolved that C4 photosynthesis, that kind that is better at handling dry weather, but not the way cactuses do it. And so this timeline is a little contentious because we don't have proper fossils that show us this kind of thing yet. So not a fully answered question yet, but that is generally what I saw online. And as this cooling and drying continued, these plants had an advantage over things like those trees that needed more water. And so they rose to take over and form these huge grasslands of the Americas, the savannas of Africa and Australia, and of certain parts of Eurasia as well. Around 13 million years ago is when this really started exploding. And you'll see various... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. These are like things that we can still see today?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So this is a little better for me to visualize since I've actually lived in the Great Plains for a couple years. But imagine sort of the Great Plains with some more trees than there are. Because it still would be a little warmer and a bit more humid, generally globally. But in places like I said, those continental interiors where water just doesn't really get to as much, the grasses that were better at this dry photosynthesis were just sort of spreading and taking over. And you can see this in, a lot of the changes to the animals around this time, because if the plants change, the animals have to change. Otherwise, they don't have any food and they die.
Right.
So some of those changes would be things like, particularly the groups of animals that I worked with a lot during my master's, which would be things like horses, especially. The horses from a little before this time mostly fed on leaves and had shorter teeth because leaves of like trees and things don't have shards of glass in them, which destroy your teeth. And then around this time, you see the transition where there are some short-toothed horses, some medium-toothed horses, and then some long-toothed horses. And then as we go on, there are no short or medium-toothed horses around today. All of them are long-toothed horses. So that just goes to show how things went globally. And this is, you can see this trend in all sorts of herbivorous mammals. So same thing happened with rhinos, same thing happened with camels. So you can see this in the morphology, the shape of the anatomy, but you can also see it in some interesting chemical things. Because of the slight difference that the C3 and C4 plants do photosynthesis, you can actually run some like chemical isotope analysis on the teeth of these horses, and you can figure out how much grass were they eating relative to leaves and stuff. So you can actually get like an actual, they were, grasses made up 80% of their diet or so. So
that's wild.
Yeah.
So that's a thing you can do.
Exactly. And you can also do things like analyze their poop or coprolites if you're fancy. And but that's less fun. That's less sciencey. What was that, Mike?
That's if you're an aristocrat.
Exactly. And so that is pretty much grass through till today. By this point in Earth's history, the grasslands that we see, like I said, in all of the large continents today were more or less in place, and then all the various animals had to change accordingly. And that's how we got to things like bison also have fairly long teeth in order to eat the grasses around the Great Plains. Things like zebras have really long teeth. They're a type of horse, so they have really long teeth to eat all the grasses on the African savannas. Kangaroos have really long teeth to eat all the grasses and stuff around Australia. And so grasses really have, like I said, shaped basically everything that we see around the world today, including, as I alluded to earlier, our own evolution into this weird bipedal monster that we have become.
Weird bipedal monster that we have become. I think that's the way I want to start referring to humans now.
Yes.
And like I've been teasing an episode about why humans are garbage since like episode 4. And it's coming at some point in the future, but not soon.
Fellow garbage monsters, you guys can look for that in the future. But until then, this has been episode 102 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Thank you, Fia, for being here. Thank you, Gavin, for that episode. And we hope to see all of you guys in a few weeks. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.